The first time I saw the church, it looked like it had been dead for a century, but somehow it was still breathing, not with air, but with something older, colder, and far more dangerous than anything I've ever felt. Its spire clawed at the sky like broken fingers reaching for help that never came, and the stained glass windows, or what was left of them, flickered in the wind like eyes that were no longer blind. The wooden doors stood wide open, but not as an invitation, more like a scream stuck in time. You could hear it. You could feel it. Something was trapped in there, and it didn't want you inside. Not because it was trying to protect you, but because it didn't want to share. The floorboards moaned like they remembered every sin that had been whispered between the pews, and the crosses, twisted and rusted, hung sideways on the walls as if even the holy had abandoned this place long ago. There are things I saw in that church that no sane person should ever have to carry, things I can never unsee. And if you really want to know why that church was never torn down, why no one talks about it, even though it sits in plain sight just outside of a place called Daggers Pass, Oregon, you'll have to listen all the way to the end, because the truth is worse than anything you're expecting. And by the time you hear it, it might already be too late. I wasn't looking for the church. I was just trying to get out of the rain. My car had died just after midnight somewhere along a stretch of road that didn't show up on my GPS, and I'd been walking for over an hour when I spotted a flicker of light in the distance. Not headlights, not a house. It was a dull, yellowish glow bleeding through the fog like a lantern burning inside an old mouth. I followed it until I came across the place, crooked, decaying, half buried in the trees. That's when I saw the sign nailed into the ground beside the entrance. It was made of splintered wood, carved by hand, with letters that looked scorched into the grain. The Church of Silent Ash. Trespassers must obey or be forgotten. That alone should have made me turn back. But the door creaked open on its own, the light grew brighter inside, and something in me, something not smart, stepped forward. I hadn't even touched the threshold when I heard the first voice. It came from a man standing just inside the doorway, tall, pale, and wearing a heavy black coat that looked soaked even though it wasn't raining. He had no expression, just two hollow eyes that didn't blink once as he said in a low, cracked voice that scraped like gravel, "If you enter, you must listen. If you listen, you must follow. If you fail, you will not leave as yourself." I asked him who he was and what this place even was, but he didn't answer. Instead, he held out a dirty folded piece of paper, forced it into my hand, and said only, "These are the rules. There are 5. Break even one, and you'll never see the hollow eye again." Now, I didn't know what the hollow eye meant at the time, not until later. But when I opened that paper, I knew something was very, very wrong. Because those rules weren't just strange, they were soaked in something I couldn't name. Like the pages had been written in a place where light doesn't go and truth bends in on itself like wet skin peeling off bone. Here's exactly what was written on the page. Rule 1. When the bell rings, cover your ears and do not move. No matter what you see, no matter what you think is calling your name, do not move until the sound stops. If you move, it will see you. If it sees you, it will remember your face. Rule 2. You may hear a child crying from beneath the pulpit. Do not speak to it. Do not look for it. It is not a child, and it never was. If you speak to it, it will follow you home, and no one else will hear it but you. Not even when it starts to whisper your name while you sleep. Rule 3. At some point, the stained glass above the altar may glow blood red and show you something familiar. A memory, a face, a moment from your life you regret. Do not look directly at it. If you do, it will drag you into it, and you'll be trapped watching it happen over and over while the church feeds on the feeling in your chest. Rule 4. You will be asked a question by someone you trust. They will not be real. You must not answer. If you speak to them, they will take your voice and you'll never speak again, not even to scream. Rule 5. You must leave before you reach the back room. If you see the door to the back room open, run. No one who has entered that room has ever returned. And if you hear what's inside call your name, it means it already knows you're coming. Reading those words, something in my bones told me they weren't written for fun or fear or as some sick prank to scare off tourists. These were written like warnings carved into a lifeboat, scratched by dying hands trying to leave a message before going under. And as I looked around the inside of that church, the way the light shifted against the walls, the way the air felt thicker with each step I took, like I was walking through invisible arms trying to hold me in place, I knew I'd made a mistake coming here. A mistake I might not survive. The man in the black coat stepped backward into the shadows without another word, disappearing into the darkness beyond the pews. The door creaked shut behind me, not slammed, just slowly, steadily, like the church was taking a breath. I tried to leave, to push it back open, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was bolted shut from the inside, even though I'd just come through it. That was when I heard it. A sound so deep it rattled my stomach. The bell. It started ringing somewhere high above the church, not like any bell I'd ever heard, but like metal screaming underwater. And I remembered the first rule. Cover your ears. Do not move, no matter what you see. So I dropped to my knees, hands over my ears, heart punching my ribs like it was trying to escape my body. The sound grew louder, not just in my ears, but in my teeth, in my spine, in the backs of my eyes. And then, in the middle of that unbearable ringing, I heard something worse. I heard my mother's voice calling my name from the far end of the church. But my mother had been dead for 3 years, and still she called me again and again in a voice that sounded exactly like hers. But I didn't move. I didn't move an inch. Because I was starting to understand, the rules weren't a suggestion. They were the only thing keeping me alive. The bell's monstrous ringing finally began to thin into a cold, rattling hum, as if the last breath of some buried thing was dying out right above me, and my arms, which had been locked so tightly over my ears that my muscles screamed from the strain, started to tremble uncontrollably. But I still refused to move, because even though the sound was fading, the air in the church had changed. It had thickened, weighted down by something unseen that pulsed through the rotting pews and crumbling stone like a living infection that had been waiting centuries just to taste a new soul. And I knew that whatever had been pretending to be my mother's voice was still standing there, just a few feet behind me, whispering my name softer now, almost sweetly, as if it was smiling while it spoke. I squeezed my eyes shut so hard that it hurt, because part of me was so sure that if I dared to open them, even for a second, I would see her, or something wearing her face, crouched there on the broken floorboards, reaching out with hands that weren't really hands at all, maybe not even touching the ground as it leaned closer and closer to me, breathing words into my hair, filling the empty spaces in the church with the smell of dirt and rot and something that felt too sharp to be called merely fear. It was something older, a terror that felt stitched into my skin itself. The silence, when it came, didn't bring peace. It was worse than the bell, far worse, because it was not a normal silence, but the kind of crushing void that makes you aware of your own heartbeat thudding too loud in your chest, as if announcing your position to every unseen thing in the building. And for a moment, I couldn't even tell if the thing behind me had gone or if it was just waiting for me to make the mistake of thinking it had left. Slowly, shakily, I opened my eyes and lifted my head, still not daring to turn around, forcing myself to stare at the darkened altar ahead, at the skeletal remains of the pews lined up like rows of rotten teeth, at the broken stone baptismal font, cracked down the middle, as if it had been split by something trying to claw its way free from inside. And even though everything in me was screaming to run, I remembered the second rule, the warning about the crying beneath the pulpit. And I knew that this church wasn't done with me yet. Taking one step forward felt like walking into a pool of ice, the chill soaking instantly through my shoes and jeans, freezing my skin from the inside out. But I gritted my teeth and kept moving, because standing still in this place felt like an even bigger risk. And as I inched toward the center aisle, I heard it. The soft, shuddering sound of a child sobbing, muffled and broken, coming from just beneath the pulpit at the far end of the church, exactly as the second rule had warned. It wasn't just crying. It was begging, tiny words choking through the gasps and whimpers. "Please help me, please. I'm so cold. Please don't leave me." And even though I knew with every instinct screaming inside me that it wasn't real, that it wasn't human, that it had never been a child, the way the voice cracked and pleaded, sounding so pathetically small and afraid, tore at something deep in my chest, and almost made me forget the rules. Almost. Grinding my jaw to keep from answering, I forced myself to stare straight ahead and walk faster, my feet making sickly wet sounds on the warped wooden floor, my hands clenched into fists so tight that my fingernails cut crescent moons into my palms. And as I passed the pulpit, I saw, out of the corner of my eye, a small hand reaching out from the shadows beneath it. A hand that looked too thin, too long, the fingers bending in ways that weren't right. But I kept walking, refusing to look at it directly, refusing to even breathe until the awful whimpering started to fade behind me. Just when I thought I might have made it past that horror, the church decided to turn the knife again. The stained glass window above the altar, cracked and filthy and long dead, suddenly flared to life in a blast of blood-red light so violent that I stumbled backward, raising my hands instinctively to shield my face. And when I peeked through my fingers, what I saw nearly sent me to my knees again. The window, twisted and melted and fractured though it was, now showed a scene I recognized instantly. My childhood bedroom, lit by the sickly glow of a nightlight, and in the center of it, a small, hunched figure sobbing alone on the bed. Me, the night my father left and never came back. The memory was so vivid, so real, that for a heartbeat I forgot everything. Forgot the church, forgot the rules, forgot that nothing here was to be trusted. And I almost looked directly into that stained glass horror, almost stepped closer, drawn by the crushing sadness and guilt that wrapped around my throat like a noose. But the rules, God, the rules, saved me again. Snapping my head down, I stared hard at the rotten floor beneath my feet, refusing to lift my gaze even as the sobbing child in the window began to call my name in my own broken voice. Each syllable a rusty fishhook digging deeper into my ears, pulling at the edges of my sanity. The red light flickered and pulsed, casting monstrous shadows that danced along the walls. And for a second, I thought I saw figures moving in the farthest pews, thin, crooked shapes that didn't quite match human proportions, their limbs too long, their heads lolling unnaturally on their necks. But I kept my focus locked downward, stepping forward blindly, trusting only the feel of the floor under my feet to guide me out of the nightmare. Somewhere behind me, the bell gave one final hollow chime, and the red light went out like a candle snuffed between cruel fingers. I don't know how long I wandered like that, hunched over, refusing to look up, before I felt the temperature of the air shift again. Growing hotter now, thick with a foul, sweet stench like rotting flowers left in a sealed coffin. And when I dared a quick glance up from the floor, I saw the door at the far back of the church. It was open, a crack at first, but widening slowly, steadily, as if the church itself were breathing it wider, exhaling something black and alive into the aisle. I froze. The fifth rule thundered through my skull like a gunshot. If you see the door to the back room open, run. My legs didn't want to move, weighted by terror, by the thick, oily heat spilling out of that black opening. But somehow, I forced them into motion, turning away from the door as a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. A wet, heavy dragging sound, something massive pulling itself across the floor, started to come from that dark room behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because the thing inside was already calling my name in a voice that didn't belong to anything that had ever lived. And it was coming. I stumbled forward into the choking darkness of the church, every muscle in my body screaming to run faster. But the air was so thick, so heavy, it felt like pushing through water. And behind me, the dragging sound grew louder, closer, until it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a vibration running up through the floorboards, a deep, shuddering tremor that made my knees nearly buckle. And I knew, somehow I knew without seeing it, that if I slowed down even a little, if I let that thing close the distance between us, I would never leave this place again, at least not as something anyone would recognize. Pews loomed around me like gravestones, their shadows long and warped under the sputtering, half-dead chandeliers overhead. And even as I forced my legs to move, even as I gasped for breath that burned my throat like smoke, the church itself seemed determined to trap me. The aisle stretching wider, the exit door growing smaller and smaller in the distance like a cruel trick of perspective, as if the building had no intention of letting me leave now that I had broken its rules. Somewhere to my left, from beneath the pulpit, a sound rose up. Thin at first, like a thread pulling itself taut, then louder, fuller, and unmistakable, the ragged, broken cries of a child. A little boy's voice, shrill and desperate, sobbing out words that stabbed into my skull. "Help me. Please. Please don't leave me here." My head jerked toward the sound before I could stop myself, the instinct to help so deeply wired into me that it almost overpowered everything else. But somewhere in the marrow of my bones, the second rule flared like a warning bell. You may hear a child crying from beneath the pulpit. Do not speak to it. Do not look for it. Tears blurred my vision, whether from terror or grief or some thick chemical sting in the air. I didn't know, but I clenched my jaw so hard I tasted blood, forced my gaze straight ahead, and kept running, even when the boy's voice broke into agonized screams. Even when it begged in a voice so heartbreakingly familiar it made my heart twist. It was my little brother's voice, even though he had never set foot inside this church, even though he was alive and safe hundreds of miles away. "You promised," the voice shrieked, and it wasn't a boy's voice anymore. It was a thing wearing my brother's voice like a mask, a thing that wanted me to look, to speak, to break the second rule, and open myself to something I could never get away from. My legs were shaking, cramping with exhaustion, but the dragging noise behind me was getting closer, louder. So loud now, it was like the whole church was filled with the sound of wet flesh scraping across ancient wood. And still, the exit seemed impossibly far away, a tiny square of gray light at the end of a nightmare corridor. The chandeliers above flickered, then dimmed, casting everything into a bruised red gloom. And in that instant, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The stained glass above the altar, glowing not with sunlight, but with a sick, pulsing crimson light. A scene was unfolding there, flickering and shifting like a living painting. My own face, twisted with grief, standing over a hospital bed, my mother lying motionless beneath a sheet, her hand slipping from mine, the heart monitor flatlining into a single, endless note. A sob wrenched itself from my throat before I could stop it, and I stumbled, almost turning toward the glass without thinking, because it pulled at me. It wanted me to look, to fall into that memory and lose myself there forever. But through the rising noise, through the cacophony of dragging and screaming and whispering, I remembered. The third rule: do not look directly at the stained glass. I squeezed my eyes shut so hard that colors burst behind my lids, gritting my teeth against the instinct to see, to feel, to relive. And half blind, half sobbing, I forced my body to keep moving forward, groping for the edge of the aisle like a drunkard, anything to put a wall or a pew between me and that impossible, bleeding light. Something cold brushed the back of my neck, a hand, or something pretending to be a hand, and I screamed, a raw animal sound that ripped itself from my lungs without permission. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back because I knew, somehow, that the thing behind me was smiling. My foot caught on the edge of a pew, and I went sprawling to the ground, palms skidding across the warped floorboards, and as I scrambled to push myself up, gasping, sobbing, the dragging sound abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden, so complete, it felt deafening. And then, softly, almost tenderly, a voice spoke from just inches behind me. A voice I would have known anywhere. "Sweetheart, it's okay now," my mother said. I froze, my hands splayed against the floor, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might shatter my ribs. "Come on," she coaxed, and I could hear the smile in her voice, warm, loving, exactly how I remembered it. "Look at me, honey. You're safe now. I'm right here." The fourth rule screamed in my mind. You will be asked a question by someone you trust. They will not be real. You must not answer. Tears streamed down my face, blurring everything into a smear of darkness and color. But I pressed my bleeding palms into the floor and pushed myself up without speaking, without turning, because if I answered, if I so much as whispered a word, I would lose my voice forever, and maybe worse. Maybe I would lose everything that made me me. The thing that wore my mother's voice let out a soft, disappointed sigh. And then, slowly, the dragging sound began again, further away this time, receding, as if whatever was hunting me had decided, for now, that I wasn't worth the effort. My legs felt hollow, my body shaking so violently I could barely stay on my feet, but I staggered forward, one step, another, until the heavy doors of the church loomed before me like the gates of heaven, splintered and ancient but real, solid, salvation just a few feet away. And then, from the shadows just beside the doors, a figure stepped out. A man, his face half in shadow, but there was something horribly familiar about him, something that made my stomach drop and my blood run cold. It was my father. Except my father had died 5 years ago. He smiled at me, the corners of his mouth cracking slightly, and said in a voice that was so real, so right, it nearly broke me in half. "Come with me, kiddo. Let's go home." And I knew, without a doubt, that if I said a single word in response, if I acknowledged him, the church would never let me go. So I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, shoved the door open with both hands, and stumbled out into the freezing, starless night. But as the church doors slammed shut behind me, I heard one last whisper, low and sibilant, curling through the darkness like smoke. "We'll be waiting." The words clung to me like cold fingers, threading into my hair, my clothes, seeping under my skin as I staggered backward from the church. The heavy oak doors rattling once, twice, behind me as if something enormous had hurled itself against them from the inside, desperate to break through and drag me back into the dark before I could escape completely. But the doors held firm, and for a long moment, all I could hear was the wild hammering of my heart and the soft, almost tender way the night air wrapped itself around me, too still, too quiet, too watchful. I stumbled down the steps, my breath coming in harsh, wet gasps that sounded too loud in the suffocating silence, and every step away from that cursed building felt like walking through invisible webs, sticky and clinging, making my skin crawl, until I finally collapsed against the crumbling stone wall that circled the perimeter of the graveyard, my knees buckling under the weight of everything I had just survived, my hands trembling so badly I could barely wipe the sweat and blood from my eyes. The sky above me was an endless, starless void, the moon hidden behind thick, roiling clouds that seemed to pulse and shift in ways that made my stomach churn. And even though I was outside, even though I had made it out, there was no relief waiting for me here, only the gnawing certainty that the church had not truly let me go, that it had only loosened its grip for now, biding its time, whispering my name into the wind so softly that the trees themselves seemed to lean closer to hear it. I didn't know how long I sat there, shaking and cold, my mind a frayed mess of terror and disbelief, until a sharp sound cut through the air, a high, brittle giggle like glass breaking. And I jerked my head up, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt, because standing at the far end of the graveyard, half hidden by the leaning gravestones and the tall, unkempt grass, was a figure so small and slight I might have missed it if not for the way it moved, twitching and jerking like a marionette with tangled strings. It was a child. A little girl in a filthy white dress, her hair matted and hanging in clumps over her face, and she was standing perfectly still, facing me, her arms dangling loosely at her sides, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. And then, softly, almost sweetly, she began to cry. The sound was delicate at first, fragile and broken. The kind of crying that would have yanked at every instinct I had to help, to comfort, if not for the rules burning themselves into my mind like brands, especially Rule 2. You may hear a child crying from beneath the pulpit. Do not speak to it. Do not look for it. It is not a child and it never was. My mouth went dry, my body screaming at me to run, to move, to do something. But I stayed frozen against the wall, clenching my jaw so hard it hurt, because even though the rules had warned me, even though I knew better, some small, stupid part of me still wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, this time it was different. That maybe there really was a child out here, lost and scared and needing someone. But then she moved, not walked, not stepped, moved. 1 second, she was across the graveyard, and the next, she was 5 feet away from me. Her face still hidden by that dripping curtain of hair, her tiny hands twitching at her sides, and the sound of her crying didn't match the way her mouth stayed closed, stitched shut by something black and glistening that looked almost like barbed wire. And in that instant, every thought, every scrap of pity or doubt evaporated, leaving only raw, animal terror. I pressed myself harder against the wall, the stones biting into my back, and the girl, or whatever wore the girl's skin, took one small, shuddering step forward, the ground beneath her feet blackening and withering as if her very presence poisoned the earth. And even though I knew better, I almost spoke. The first syllable bubbled up in my throat, a cracked, desperate R. Before I slammed my teeth together hard enough to taste blood again, the sound dying before it could escape. And in the suffocating silence that followed, the girl stopped moving, her head cocking sharply to the side, listening. For a breathless moment, we simply stared at each other. Or rather, I stared at the tangled mass of hair and ruined dress that hid her face. And then, without a sound, she turned and drifted away, her feet barely touching the ground, vanishing between the gravestones like smoke, like mist, until the graveyard was empty once more. My entire body felt hollowed out, scraped raw, but I forced myself to move, to peel myself away from the wall and stagger forward, my legs numb and unsteady, because I couldn't stay here. Not with that thing still somewhere nearby, not with the church still whispering my name through the cold earth. And so I stumbled toward the rusted iron gates that marked the edge of the property, praying with every broken step that they wouldn't be locked. They weren't. With a final gasping sob, I shoved through them and stumbled out onto the cracked, weed-choked road beyond, the sudden emptiness of it hitting me like a blow. Because there was nothing. No lights, no cars, not even the hum of insects or the rustle of the wind. Only the vast, oppressive silence and the knowledge that I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I didn't know where I was. The road stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the thick blackness of the woods. And when I turned to look behind me to catch one last glimpse of the church, there was nothing there. No building, no graveyard, only the endless empty fields under a sky that looked too close, too heavy, pressing down on me like a hand. My breath hitched, panic scraping its claws through my chest, because I had been there, I had seen it, felt it, the blood still fresh and sticky in my mouth, proof that it hadn't been a dream. And yet now it was as if it had never existed at all. As if it had swallowed itself whole, retreating back into whatever nightmare had spawned it, leaving me stranded and shaking in a place that somehow felt even more wrong than the church itself. Somewhere behind me, back in the fields or the woods, the bell began to ring. A single, low peal that vibrated through the ground, through my bones. And before I even realized what I was doing, I dropped to my knees, slamming my hands over my ears so hard it hurt, clenching my eyes shut against the darkness pressing in from all sides. I didn't move. I didn't dare. Because Rule 1 was clear, more clear now than ever. When the bell rings, cover your ears and do not move. No matter what you see, no matter what you think is calling your name, do not move until the sound stops. And as the first figure stepped out of the woods, tall, skeletal, its mouth stretching far too wide in a soundless scream, I knew that if I so much as twitched, it would see me. And if it saw me, it would never forget my face. So I knelt there in the brittle grass, the frozen ground biting into my knees through my jeans, hands clamped so tightly against the sides of my head that my arms began to shake under the strain. And even though every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to crawl, to even breathe heavier than a whisper, I stayed locked in place, because somehow, deep inside the marrow of my bones, I understood that moving meant death or something far, far worse. And all I could do was listen to the muffled toll of the bell, its cold vibration sinking deeper into my flesh with each haunting strike. From the thin slits of my closed eyes, I caught flashes of movement. More figures joining the first, dragging themselves free from the woods like puppets dangling from broken strings, their limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, their mouths yawning open to reveal rows of jagged, splintered teeth. And though they made no sound, it was as if their very presence was screaming at me, begging me to flinch, to look, to give them a reason to know me. I don't know how long I stayed like that. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. But the sound of the bell eventually began to waver, the final peal trailing off into a whimper that seemed to linger in the mist pooling at my feet. And even after silence fell, thick and absolute, I kept my hands clamped tight, my body frozen, because I didn't trust the quiet, not after what I had seen slip free of the woods. And when a voice hissed right beside my ear, "You can look now." In the unmistakable rasp of my mother, I nearly bit through my own tongue to keep from screaming. My mother had been gone for years, buried in the same damp cemetery that bordered the woods, now coughing up nightmares. And I knew with a certainty that made my stomach churn with acid, that if I opened my eyes or so much as twitched at the sound of her voice, I would never see another sunrise. The ground was so cold beneath me that my legs began to go numb, and the ache in my muscles built until it was almost unbearable. But still, I stayed locked in place, sweat pouring down my face in freezing rivers, because even though the bell had stopped, I could feel the things still watching me, standing in a silent, seething circle just beyond the thin veil of my clenched eyelids. One of them, a voice thick with honey and rot, leaned so close that I could smell the stench of damp earth and blood on its breath as it whispered, "We're so proud of you." And for a terrible second, something inside me yearned to believe it, to believe that somehow enduring this horror had earned me some twisted kind of approval. But the thought was not my own, and the second I recognized that, the voice fell silent, retreating with a low, disappointed hiss. Finally, when my arms trembled so badly that my muscles felt ready to tear themselves apart, when the cold had seeped into the marrow of my bones and the figures had begun to drift back into the trees, melting into the darkness one by one, I risked a glance, just a crack of one eye, just enough to see, and found that the field was empty once more. The only sign of their passage, the broken grass and the deep, clawed gouges scored into the frozen earth around me. Slowly, trembling with cold and fear, I pushed myself to my feet, every movement stiff and halting, my body rebelling against the very idea of moving again. And when I stumbled forward, it was like learning to walk for the first time. Every step a desperate, clumsy battle against the screaming instincts that told me to collapse and never get up again. The church loomed in the distance, a black, broken silhouette against the starless sky. And though every rational part of my mind howled at me to run in the opposite direction, to flee into the woods and never look back, I knew I had no choice. I had to finish what I had started, had to survive the night, because the rules were not suggestions, and the church was not a place you simply walked away from. I staggered back toward the rotting steps, the cold wind clawing at my face, and as I reached the cracked door, it swung inward on its own, creaking on rusted hinges, revealing a long, dark hallway I didn't recognize, lined with crooked, sagging pews and walls slick with something wet and black that dripped from the ceiling in slow, heavy drops. Stepping inside, the air grew heavier, thicker, pressing against my chest until every breath was a conscious effort. And somewhere ahead, from beneath the cracked pulpit, I heard it. The soft, wet sounds of a child crying, the voice so small, so heartbreakingly real, that for a moment I forgot Rule 2, forgot everything except the aching need to help, to comfort, to save. "Please," the voice whimpered, a little girl's voice, thin and trembling. And when I forced my eyes away from the shadows pooling beneath the pulpit, focusing instead on the distant, splintered altar, the urge to respond almost dragged the words from my throat. But I bit down hard, grinding my teeth together until I tasted blood, because Rule 2 was clear. It was not a child. It never had been. As I inched along the wall, careful not to look at the pulpit, not to let the crying tear into the fragile shield I had built around my sanity, the voice grew louder, more desperate, sobbing and hiccuping. "I'm so cold. Please don't leave me here." And when a small, pale hand slipped out from the darkness and clutched at the hem of my jacket, I nearly screamed, barely managing to rip free without looking down, without acknowledging the thing pretending to be a little girl. The walls seemed to close in around me as I reached the front of the church again, the faint moonlight filtering through the cracked stained glass overhead. And I remembered with a sick lurch that Rule 3 was coming. The warning about the blood-red light, the memories, the regret, and already, the center panel above the altar was beginning to glow, a slow, pulsing red that painted the rotting pews and weeping walls in shades of gore. I turned my head down, staring at my own shoes, at the broken stones beneath my feet, refusing to look at the glass, even as a familiar voice floated down from above. My own voice, younger, trembling, begging forgiveness for something I didn't want to remember. "Don't look," I whispered to myself, voice shaking, and though every fiber of my being wanted to glance up to see what it was, to find out if maybe, just maybe, there was something left to fix, I kept my gaze locked to the floor, moving forward step by agonizing step toward the altar. And when the glass above me shuddered, letting out a long, low moan that rattled the very bones of the church, I knew I had only a few seconds before it tried to drag me into whatever nightmare it had built from my past. The pulpit groaned as something shifted beneath it, the sobbing child's voice breaking into frantic shrieks. And without thinking, without looking, I bolted past it. The rotten boards cracking beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the narrow side door that I prayed led somewhere. Anywhere, but back into the arms of the church. But as I threw myself against the door, forcing it open with a tortured scream of wood and metal, I saw it. Just for a moment, just long enough to make my heart turn to ice. The back room door, standing wide open at the far end of a corridor slick with shadows, and from the gaping darkness beyond, something called my name in a voice that was not a voice at all, a wet, gurgling imitation that made my soul shrivel in horror. And I knew with every cell in my body, that if I didn't run now, right now, it would be too late. My legs reacted before the rest of me could catch up, hurling me into the narrow corridor as the door slammed back against the wall with a deafening crack. And though every instinct screamed at me to look back, to check if that open back room was spewing out something worse than the voice that had already tried to claim me, I forced myself forward, each pounding step rattling through the hollow bones of the church like a starting gun that had awakened everything hidden inside the rotting walls and the black hollows of the pews. Things that seemed to stretch and twitch and breathe with a hunger that was no longer content to just watch me from the shadows. The corridor stretched longer than it should have, the air thickening into a kind of syrup that clawed at my clothes and hair, pulling, dragging, whispering, and every few feet, another door yawned open into darkness, each one leaking a breath of cold so bitter it burned the skin on my arms and face. And from somewhere deep within those doorways, I could hear voices, broken, sobbing, pleading, voices that belonged to people I knew were long dead. Voices I had never thought to hear again, except maybe in dreams or nightmares. "Help me," a woman's voice cried, and I recognized it with a lurch of my stomach so violent I nearly stumbled, because it was my mother's voice. My mother, who had died 5 years ago, who had been buried in a small plot of land miles and miles from this cursed place. But I kept my head down, my gaze pinned to the threadbare rug stretching down the center of the hall, my hands clenching into fists so tight my nails bit into my palms, drawing thin lines of blood that made it real, made it tangible, kept me grounded against the growing swell of unreality pressing in from all sides. I didn't speak. I didn't look. I didn't even let myself think about it too hard, because even now, with my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough that it felt like it might break free, I remembered Rule 4. Remembered it like a brand pressed into the meat of my brain. And I knew that if I so much as opened my mouth, if I whispered back to the mother who wasn't my mother, if I even acknowledged her, the thing wearing her voice would take my voice from me forever. The corridor seemed to warp and bend as I ran, the walls breathing in and out, the faded wallpaper blistering and peeling as black tendrils snaked out from the seams, reaching for my legs, my arms, my throat, and somewhere far ahead, I thought I glimpsed the promise of another door. Not like the others, not yawning open into endless blackness, but solid, battered, real. And I focused everything on it, on the idea that if I could just reach it, if I could just make it there, I might still have a chance to get out of this nightmare alive. The crying child's voice, the one from beneath the pulpit, had found its way into the hall now, rising and falling in pitiful wails that scratched against my brain like rusted nails. And when it spoke, when it croaked out my name in that tiny, broken voice, I almost faltered, almost turned. But somewhere in the mess of terror and adrenaline that had become my mind, I reminded myself again and again that it was not a child, that it had never been a child. And if I looked for it, if I tried to help it, it would follow me home, and there would be no escaping it then. As I stumbled forward, barely dodging a snatching hand that burst from a crack in the wall, fingers too long, skin split and leaking something thick and black, another figure appeared ahead of me, standing squarely between me and the door. A figure I recognized immediately, even though every instinct screamed that it couldn't be real, that it wasn't real. It was my best friend, Ethan, standing there with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his hands hanging limp at his sides, his clothes stained with something dark and wet. And when he spoke, when he asked, in a voice low and broken, "Why didn't you help me?" The force of the grief and guilt that hit me nearly stopped me cold. Ethan had died 2 years ago, drowned under ice too thin to hold him. And even though I had been there, even though I had tried to save him, I hadn't made it in time. And now here he was, standing between me and freedom, his face pale and ruined, his voice baiting me, begging me to answer. My lips cracked open without thinking, the start of a word, his name, scraping against my throat like broken glass. But at the very last moment, the memory of the rules slammed into me like a blow, and I clamped my mouth shut so hard I bit my tongue, tasting coppery blood as tears blurred my vision, and I barreled forward, straight toward him, straight through him. He didn't resist. He didn't try to grab me. He simply ceased, like smoke blown away by a stiff wind, and I burst into the final stretch of the hallway, the battered door just a few desperate feet ahead. The sobbing, the whispers, the voices, all rose into a shrieking crescendo behind me, a storm of anguish and rage that battered at my mind, and the ground beneath me seemed to tilt and lurch as if the very foundation of the church was trying to hurl me back toward the open maw of the back room. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I didn't think. I hit the door at full speed, slamming into it with my shoulder, and for a breathless second I thought it wouldn't give, that I would be trapped here forever in this writhing hell. But then the lock tore free with a screech of rusted metal, and I spilled out into the night, the cold, blessed night, collapsing onto ground that was wet with dew and free of the corruption that choked the church. Behind me, from deep within the corridor, I heard the door to the back room slam shut with a sound like the earth itself cracking open. And for a moment, everything went terrifyingly, deafeningly still. I lay there gasping for breath, staring up at a sky smeared with low, roiling clouds, my heart rattling against my ribs like a wild thing desperate to escape. And it was only then, only after the worst had passed, that I realized the bell was still ringing. A slow, deep, bone-rattling sound, louder now, closer, as if whatever had rung it in the first place had come looking for me. And this time, I wasn't safe. This time, it knew me. The sound of the bell gnawed at the edges of my mind, each resonant toll sinking into my bones like cold iron. And though every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee into the darkness and never look back, I knew, with a certainty that filled my stomach with icy dread, that moving now would be the end of me, because the rules were clear, brutally clear, and if I moved while the bell rang, it would see me, and if it saw me, it would never, ever forget. I pressed my hands hard against my ears, squeezing my eyes shut so tightly that colors bloomed behind my lids, trying to block out not just the noise, but the overwhelming sense of wrongness that was slithering closer, because the very air around me had changed, thickening with a cloying, unnatural weight, as if the night itself were being squeezed through a rotting sieve. I could feel it, not just hear it, a presence, vast and ancient, brushing against the edges of my awareness, like a hand with too many fingers, probing, searching, tasting the fear that leaked from my pores, no matter how tightly I clenched every muscle to keep still. The seconds stretched into agonizing eternities, each booming clang of the bell shuddering through my body, and I could hear things moving in the dark beyond the field. Soft, shuffling footsteps, the brittle snap of twigs under something heavy, the wet rasp of breathing that didn't sound human, and worst of all, the faint, horrible sound of my name being whispered again and again by voices that belonged to no one I could see. "Come on, just answer me," a voice said to my left, heartbreakingly familiar. And even with my ears covered, even through the vibrating wall of sound, I recognized it immediately. It was my sister's voice, raw and pleading, the way it had sounded the night she died. But I knew better. God, I knew better. Because my sister was gone, buried years ago in a grave I had visited every birthday since, and no matter how much the thing in the dark tried to peel my memories apart like rotting fruit, I would not answer. I squeezed my eyes tighter, breathing through my teeth, counting the tolls of the bell like stepping stones across a boiling river. Because somewhere deep inside, I believed, or maybe just hoped, that the bell would eventually stop, that there would be a moment when the world would slip back into something I could survive. If only I could last that long without giving in to the rising urge to scream. The ground beneath me, slick with dew and mud, suddenly shifted, buckling as though something enormous and unseen had pressed its weight down nearby. And a low, rumbling growl rose up from the earth itself, vibrating up through my body until my teeth ached and my bones buzzed with terror. And then mercifully, with a final drawn-out clang that seemed to suck all the air out of the world, the bell stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, suffocating, absolute, and I dared to crack my eyes open just enough to see the field around me bathed in the faint, sickly light of a hidden moon. The church behind me slumped against the horizon like a dying beast, and the air so heavy with expectation that I could hardly breathe. I waited, straining every nerve, listening for the telltale sound of approaching footsteps, for the ragged whisper of my name from unseen mouths. But there was nothing but the ragged beat of my own heart and the shallow gasp of my own breath. Slowly, so slowly, I thought my muscles would snap from the tension. I lowered my hands from my ears, my arms trembling violently, my body screaming for me to move. But I stayed frozen for a few more seconds, just to be sure. When I finally pushed myself up onto my knees, the cold mud clinging to my palms, I realized with a sick lurch that the field wasn't as empty as I had thought. Standing at the edge of the tree line were figures, dozens of them, their outlines barely distinguishable from the shadows, motionless and silent, watching. My throat locked up, my mind desperately refusing to process what my eyes were showing me. Because these figures, these things, didn't move like people, didn't breathe like people. They simply stood there, wrong in ways I couldn't describe, their presence sinking into the night like oil into water. A soft voice, a man's this time, drifted across the field, so quiet it barely stirred the air, and it said my name with such aching familiarity that for a split second my body almost betrayed me, almost answered, but I clamped my jaw shut so hard my teeth clicked together painfully. "Please, it's me," the voice said again, and it sounded like my father who had been dead for 5 years, my father who had held my hand as he slipped away in a sterile hospital room. And I bit down harder, tears leaking from the corners of my eyes, because the thing calling to me was wearing his voice like a mask, and I would not let it steal anything else from me. I stumbled to my feet, my legs barely able to hold me, and forced myself to move, to stagger away from the church, away from the figures, even as every instinct in my body screamed that I was walking straight into another trap, because there was nowhere safe anymore, nowhere untouched by whatever nightmare I had woken. The trees loomed closer with every stumbling step, their branches clawing at the sky like broken fingers, and I could feel something waiting just beyond them, something that had been patient, so patient, but now stirred with eager hunger. As I crossed the invisible threshold into the woods, the figures at the edge of the field began to move, not rushing, not lunging, but gliding forward with slow, deliberate certainty, as if they knew they didn't need to hurry, as if they knew I had already lost. The darkness closed in around me, the trees swallowing what little light there was, and somewhere deep among the twisted trunks, I heard it again. A child's soft, hiccuping sobs, broken and desperate, echoing through the night. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms hard enough to draw blood, reminding myself of Rule 2, of the terrible price of giving in to pity, and I turned my face away from the sound, even as it grew louder, closer, threading through the trees like a needle through flesh. I did not speak. I did not look. I forced my broken body to keep moving, though every step deeper into the forest felt like descending another rung into some private hell built just for me. Ahead, through the tangled branches, I saw it. A faint, flickering light, bobbing gently like a lantern swaying in the wind. And for a wild, hopeful moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was salvation, someone real, someone human. But then the light jerked sideways, impossibly fast, and I heard a wet, gurgling laugh that made my blood run cold. I knew then that I wasn't just being chased. I was being herded, driven deeper into the woods, towards something that had been waiting for a very long time. The moment that realization sank its teeth into me, sinking deeper than bone, something primal and raw exploded inside my chest. a frantic, desperate need to break free from whatever unseen trap was tightening around me. And yet, even as I stumbled backward, ripping through branches that clawed at my skin like skeletal hands, I could feel that thing's influence pressing closer, shaping the very paths around me, making the woods twist and shift so that every step I took only drove me nearer to the unseen center of whatever nightmare I had awakened. The light flickered again, now split into 2, then 3, each one darting at impossible angles between the trees. And I realized with mounting horror that they weren't lanterns at all. They were eyes, vast and lidless, gleaming with a hungry intelligence that understood exactly how terrified I was and exactly how far I would run before my body gave out. Branches whipped across my face, stinging and drawing blood, the scent of iron mixing with the thick, moldy dampness of the earth. And above it all, the bell's low, thrumming toll still vibrated in the marrow of my bones, each peal a summons I could not ignore, no matter how much I wanted to tear my ears off just to escape it. Then, from somewhere far behind me, through the choking blackness, I heard a voice call my name, my real name, in a tone so achingly familiar, so warm and safe, that it almost buckled my knees where I stood. It was my mother's voice. But my mother had been dead for 5 years. "No," I gasped aloud, my voice breaking in the cold night air, and I clamped a hand over my mouth at once, as if the very act of responding would somehow give whatever wore her voice the permission it needed to reach me. "Sweetheart," the voice said again, thick with a love that curled and rotted as it stretched the vowels of my name, coming closer now, threading between the trees, just like the false crying had. "Come here. Come back. It's safe now." I squeezed my eyes shut, teeth gritted so hard they ached, forcing my body to stumble forward again, even as every instinct screamed to turn around and run toward her, to fall into her arms like I had when I was a child terrified of thunderstorms. But I wasn't a child anymore. And that thing behind me wasn't my mother. The woods grew thicker, the trees pressing in until the only way forward was to squeeze between them, the bark scraping layers from my skin with every frantic step. And just when I thought I couldn't take another inch, the forest seemed to fall away beneath my feet, and I stumbled out into a clearing so sudden and vast it felt wrong, like a wound torn open in the flesh of the earth. At the center of the clearing stood the church. Or, no, it was the church, and it wasn't. The stones were blackened and melted, as if from some ancient fire, the steeple cracked and leaning precariously to one side, and the stained glass windows, the same ones that had once glowed with holy scenes, now shivered with a dull, blood-red light, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. And the bell, that awful, bone-shaking bell, hung from the broken steeple, swinging in a wind I could not feel, louder now, closer, every toll sending waves of sickness rolling through my body. Somewhere deep within the broken carcass of the church, I could see movement, slow, deliberate, and wrong, as if something vast was unfolding itself after a very long sleep. Then, from just behind me, so close that I could feel the breath of it stirring the hair on the back of my neck, the voice whispered again, this time not my mother's, but another voice I knew, one I trusted even more. It was Daniel's voice, my brother, dead 6 years this past March, and he said, "Come on, it's safe, I promise. You don't have to be scared anymore." I bit down on my knuckle hard enough to taste blood, holding back a sob, knowing that if I turned around, if I so much as acknowledged it, Rule 4 would claim me, and I would never speak again. Instead, I bolted, sprinting full speed toward the shattered church, the lesser evil now, feeling the ground tremble underfoot as the thing behind me grew impatient, its false voices hardening into snarls and gurgling rage. I reached the threshold of the church and stumbled inside, the ruined door falling from its hinges at my touch. And the moment I crossed over, it was as if the world outside simply disappeared. The sounds of pursuit swallowed whole by a silence so thick it felt like drowning in a black ocean. Inside, the church was worse than I remembered. The pews were little more than splinters. The altar was cracked down the middle like a split skull. And from somewhere beneath the pulpit, I could hear it again, the crying. But this time, it was no longer pretending to be a child. The sound was too wet, too thick, with something that was not grief, but hunger. And though I squeezed my eyes shut and clamped my hands over my ears, the noise slithered into my head like a worm burrowing into soft meat, whispering promises of rest, of safety. of an end to this endless running. The stained glass pulsed again, casting the entire nave in a ghastly, blood-soaked glow. And though I knew, I knew, not to look directly at it, my traitorous eyes flicked upward and caught a glimpse of the scene it showed. It was my father, standing in our old kitchen, his face crumpled in anger, his fist raised, the air around him shimmering with the heat of old rage and older regrets. A moment I had buried so deep I barely remembered it. And yet here it was, raw and bleeding before me. And for one awful second, I could feel it dragging at my soul, trying to pull me into it like a spider yanking a fly into its web. I ripped my gaze away with a choked scream, stumbling backward, and my heel caught on something soft, something that shifted beneath my weight. And when I looked down, I saw that the floor was littered with hands. Pale, grasping hands, all of them reaching upward from the cracked stone, clutching at me with fingers that felt too real, too warm, as they wrapped around my ankles and calves, trying to drag me down into the floor. I tore free with a howl, wrenching myself forward, and that was when I saw it. At the very end of the nave, where the back wall of the church should have been, there was a door that should not have been there. A door slightly ajar, through which I could hear a voice. No, not a voice, my voice, calling to me with breathless urgency, pleading for help. And in that moment, every rule, every scrap of reason, every ounce of strength I had clung to was tested. Because Rule 5 burned like a brand across my mind, warning me, if you see the door open, run. But I was so tired, so broken, and I could hear myself pleading, screaming, begging for rescue, and it sounded so real. Trembling, I took one step closer, just one, and the door creaked wider, spilling a foul, stinking wind across the ruined floor. And then something stepped through, something that wore my face, something that smiled at me with teeth that were far too many, far too long, as it whispered in a voice that was mine, and yet not mine at all. You're already home. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out, none at all, not even a whisper. The thing that wore my face took another step toward me, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet yanked along by trembling, invisible strings. And though my mind screamed at my body to flee, to fight, to do anything at all, I remained rooted there, paralyzed, as if the earth itself had risen up around my ankles to trap me in place, while the thing's too wide smile split even further across its stolen face, leaking something dark and viscous from the corners of its mouth that dripped down its chin and hit the broken floorboards with a soft, sickening sizzle. The air around me had gone heavy, thick like molasses, and every breath scraped my throat raw as I stared at this monstrosity that looked so much like me, and yet so hideously wrong. And when it spoke again, tilting its head at an unnatural angle so far to the side I heard the bones crack and snap, it used my voice, but it was layered. Something else spoke just beneath it, deeper, older, and impossibly vast. You broke the rules, the creature crooned, each syllable stretching into a low, wet sound, and as it took another lurching step, its feet, if they were still feet, sloshed and dragged, leaving a slick black trail behind it that hissed and smoked when it touched the ground. My mind flailed wildly, trying to remember, trying to cling to the few shreds of the rules I still understood. The stained glass, the crying child, the bell, the trusted face asking a question. And now the final one, the back room, the room no one could enter. The room I was supposed to run from the second the door opened, but I had hesitated, had faltered. And now I was standing too close, far too close, while the thing reached out a hand that was too many fingers, too many joints, bending and twisting in ways no human hand ever could. No, I tried to say, tried to force sound past the icy lump in my throat, but all that came out was a thin, reedy gasp, barely louder than the whisper of the rotted wind that still curled from the doorway behind the thing, carrying with it the rancid stink of decay and wet earth and something far fouler, something that had never belonged to this world at all. The thing that wore my face laughed, a bubbling, gurgling sound like something drowning slowly in thick mud, and in one sudden, snapping movement, it lunged forward, its fingers brushing my cheek with a coldness so profound it burned, and I stumbled backward instinctively, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped, dying thing. The floor beneath me groaned and splintered with every desperate step, and somewhere behind me, I heard the bell ring again, faint, distorted, as if underwater. But it was enough to jolt something primal and ancient in my mind awake. And I clapped my hands over my ears without thinking, squeezing my eyes shut, even as the creature shrieked my name in a voice that splintered against the insides of my skull. I felt it rushing at me, felt the floor shudder and crack beneath its weight. But I did not move, did not breathe, did not dare even to flinch, and the sound grew louder and louder, like 1,000 insects crawling beneath my skin, like nails dragging across bone, until I thought I would go mad from the sheer pressure of it. Then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence was worse. I opened my eyes to find the creature gone, leaving only that slimy, smoking trail across the floorboards that led back to the open door of the back room, where darkness pulsed and breathed like a living thing. And for one horrifying moment, I thought I saw hands, too many hands, reaching and writhing just beyond the threshold, beckoning me closer. Somewhere far behind me, deeper in the forest, another bell rang. Clearer this time, sharper, and I realized with a sick lurch of understanding that the church was calling me back, that whatever lurked inside the back room wasn't content to wait anymore. Staggering, half blind with terror, I turned and fled, feet slipping on the slick black trails left behind by the creature, arms flailing wildly for balance as the walls of the crumbling church seemed to lean inward, closer, as if the building itself were trying to crush me within its rotting ribs. The aisles twisted and warped around me, every step taking me somewhere I didn't recognize. Corridors sprouting where none had been before. Doorways yawning open into rooms filled with things that should not have been able to move or breathe or watch me with lidless, empty eyes. And through it all, that foul, whispering wind pursued me, carrying fragments of broken voices, all speaking my name in tones both mocking and mournful. At one point, I rounded a corner and nearly collided with a figure standing in the center of the hall, my mother. Or at least, the thing that wore her face, her eyes weeping thick, black ichor as she reached for me with trembling hands and sobbed, "Please, help me, please, don't leave me here." In a voice so familiar, so heart-wrenchingly real that I staggered a step forward before Rule 4 slammed into my mind like a hammer, and I clamped my jaw shut so hard my teeth rattled. The thing that wore my mother's face howled, the sound bursting from it in a spray of black bile that steamed where it hit the walls. And I ran past it, not looking, not slowing, heart battering against my ribs so violently I thought it would tear free from my chest. And all the while the corridors narrowed, the air thickened, and the sound of the back room door, creaking wider, 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 grew louder behind me. Somewhere up ahead, I caught a glimpse of the ruined entrance, the night beyond vast and terrible and free, and hope flared in my chest, raw and desperate. But then the pews began to move, to shift, grinding across the floor as if dragged by invisible hands, forming walls, a maze, boxing me in, driving me back toward the source of that stinking, sucking wind. Gasping, I skidded to a halt, heart slamming against my ribs, and turned to find the doorway to the back room no longer across the church, but right in front of me, yawning wide and black and endless, and from its depths came the sound of my own voice, broken and pleading, begging me to come home. The ground beneath me began to crack, splintering outward from the doorway like the spreading roots of a great and terrible tree. And through the fractures I could see something moving far, far below. Vast, writhing shapes, mouths opening and closing soundlessly, arms and legs and eyes and things I had no words for, all reaching upward toward me. Frozen in place, mind blank with terror, I watched as one long, boneless arm slithered up through the nearest crack, reaching, questing, fingers splayed wide. And I knew with the sick, absolute certainty of a dream turning into a nightmare, that if it touched me even once, it would drag me down into that howling dark, and I would never ever find my way back. Somewhere inside me, something finally snapped. With a scream that tore free from my throat in a raw, broken sound, I turned and ran, not looking back, not daring even to breathe, as I sprinted for the door, for the night, for the slim, impossible chance of escape, before the church closed around me forever. I ran, the splintered floor groaning and breaking apart beneath my pounding feet, every step a gamble against the void that seethed and gnashed below, the rotted wood threatening to collapse entirely as the air filled with a terrible, low chanting, a sound so vast and ancient it seemed to rattle inside my very bones. And though my lungs burned and my vision blurred with tears of pure terror, I forced myself onward because I knew that if I so much as faltered, even for an instant, the things clawing and writhing beneath me would seize their chance and pull me into the abyss where no light and no prayer could ever reach. Somewhere behind me, the thing that wore my face was still coming, its voice rising above the chanting in a sing-song mocking tone that made my blood freeze, calling out in my voice, "Come home, come home, come home." The words twisting and warping until they were nothing but guttural sounds that scraped against my ears like broken glass. And even though every instinct screamed for me to look, to see how close it was, I clenched my eyes shut tighter, trusting only in my memory of the ruined pews and broken aisles to guide me, knowing if I saw it, it would be over. The front door was so close now, just a few yards away, its heavy frame leaning crookedly off its hinges, and the night beyond it looked impossibly dark and impossibly wide, a freedom so close I could almost taste it. When suddenly, the bell rang out again, a single, deafening toll that shivered the air and made the ground lurch sickeningly beneath me. And though I tried to clamp my hands over my ears like the rules demanded, I stumbled and fell to my knees, the cracked wood biting into my flesh, the sound vibrating through my entire body as if the bell were inside my skull, reverberating through every nerve and every bone. The moment I hit the ground, I heard it, my name, spoken in a soft, pleading voice, a voice I hadn't heard in years, a voice I would have given anything to hear again, my brother's voice, who had died 3 years ago, calling to me from somewhere close by, saying, "Please, don't leave me here." And the agony in his tone was so raw, so heartbreakingly real, that for a moment, just a moment, my hand lifted from my ear, my head beginning to turn toward the sound, my heart cracking open inside my chest. But the second my hand shifted, something unseen brushed my fingertips, something cold and slick and writhing like a snake made of shadows, and instinct, pure and brutal, took over, slamming my hands back over my ears as tightly as I could and squeezing my eyes shut even harder, curling in on myself as the chanting grew louder, rising into a fever pitch, and the floor beneath me heaved like the deck of a sinking ship, cracks widening, the monstrous arms reaching higher, fingers brushing the soles of my shoes as I forced myself upright again. I didn't dare look. I didn't dare listen. I just ran. The door was just there, just within reach, and with a final, desperate lunge, I hurled myself through it. And the moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The chanting cut off as if someone had slashed it with a knife, the terrible pressure inside my skull vanishing, and the night outside rushed to meet me with a fierce, icy wind that smelled of pine and frost and freedom. And for a split second, I hoped it was over. But when I hit the ground outside, rolling onto the cracked concrete steps, I realized something was terribly, horribly wrong. The church behind me, the church that had been crumbling and rotted and abandoned for decades, now stood whole and pristine, its stone walls clean and shining, the stained glass windows burning with unnatural blood-red light, and standing in front of the massive carved doors was a figure wearing the same clothes as me, with my same hair, my same face, watching me with a wide, gleeful grin full of too many teeth. It spoke. I spoke, in a voice that was thinner and sharper than my own, a voice that seemed to scrape the very air as it said, "You left too late. It knows you now. It will always know you." Before I could move, before I could even scream, the bell inside the church began to toll again. Once, twice, 3 times. And with each peal, I felt something inside me fray and snap, like threads pulling loose from an old, worn tapestry. My vision swimming, my breath catching in my throat as the world around me twisted and shuddered. I stumbled backward down the steps, trying to get away, trying to run. But the ground beneath my feet cracked open again, the same fractures from inside the church now racing across the pavement, black voids yawning wide to reveal the same writhing, impossible mass of limbs and mouths and eyes waiting below. And no matter which way I turned, the cracks were already there, already spreading, already waiting. Behind me, my double, the thing, laughed, a high, keening sound that was half child, half animal, and it called after me in a sing-song voice, The rules kept you safe, but you broke them all, and now it's time to come home. I tried to run, but every step took me closer to the cracks, closer to the gaping chasm, until finally my foot slipped, catching on the crumbling edge of the concrete, and I fell hard, my hands scrabbling for purchase as the ground gave way beneath me and I tumbled down into the dark. As I fell, I heard voices all around me. The crying child from beneath the pulpit, the trusted voice that had asked me a question, the sound of the stained glass shattering into 1,000 screaming shards, the endless tolling of the bell, and through it all, louder than anything else, I heard the thing that wore my face whispering, "Home, home, home," until the word lost all meaning and became nothing but sound, endless and suffocating. The last thing I saw, before the darkness swallowed me whole, was the church doors slamming shut, sealing tight with a final echoing boom, trapping me inside whatever nightmare I had unleashed. And somewhere, deep in the blackness, something opened its arms to welcome me. And this time, I could not run. This time, I was already theirs, forever.